So I am very excited to have with me today Ross Barkan, who is a columnist and author. He's a staff writer with New York Magazine. He's contributed to Jacobin and many other publications as well. I think Ross is about as plugged into New York politics as anybody I follow, so I'm very thrilled to have him here today. Ross, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be on to talk New York and anything else that's on your mind.
Absolutely. Very quickly, I want to encourage the audience to follow Ross at Ross Barkan on Twitter and also make sure to tune into his Substack, rossbarkan.substack.com. So we obviously last week had a series of primaries in New York and a special election. Can you start with, I think a lot of this is sort of framed within the redistricting, and that seemed to have a major impact. Can you just kind of explain how the districts that were drawn came to be?
Sure. So, a funny thing happened. The Democrats who control the state legislature thought that for the first time in modern history, they would control the redistricting process. Though New York is a Democratic state, for a variety of reasons, Republicans have held the state Senate for most of the last 50 years, if not longer. So this time around, with full control of both chambers, the Democrats believe they could legally do it, come together, draw districts. There is a redistricting commission that was quite poorly set up by the prior governor, Andrew Cuomo, who resigned in disgrace, and it deadlocked. And this supposedly allowed the legislature to make districts. So they came out with lines that were Democratic friendly, and everyone, including myself, figured they would hold up in court. The Republicans brought a legal challenge to them. Long story short, the highest court in New York State shot down the maps and said that it violated a 2014 constitutional amendment banning gerrymandering and didn't follow proper procedure. And so a court-appointed special master was told to draw new districts. So, this was an independent individual and redistricting expert who became overnight the most influential person in New York. And he sketched new districts very quickly. Within the span of a month, there was very little public input and a few hearings, and they were not accessible. The upside was the districts he drew were pretty fair. They were not as Democrat friendly, but they also were drawn to maximize competitiveness and also compactness, since New York has a long history of strangely drawn districts. And so out of this process came the new 10th congressional district, where you just had a very competitive primary that Dan Goldman won, and Yuli New, one of the progressive challengers, may run against him again in the general on a third party line. You got a new 12th district, which combined the east side and west sides of Manhattan and threw Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney into a single district, and they are the two most senior members now of the congressional delegation in New York City. They each chair committees in the House, and they were forced to run against each other. Jerry Nadler won that race. And you also had some interesting chaos north of the city, where Mondaire Jones, a rising progressive, was put into a district, technically with Jamal Bowman, though most of the seat was in a district that a centrist, Sean Patrick Maloney, the head of the DCCC, decided to run for. So Mondaire Jones, rather than run against Jamal Bowman or Sean Patrick Maloney, and a lot of progressives wanted Mondaire Jones to take on Sean Patrick Maloney, he decided to leave the suburbs of New York altogether, move to Brooklyn, and run in that 10th district that Dan Goldman would end up winning. And it appears, at least temporarily, Mondaire Jones's career is now over.
Yeah, and I understand that Maloney's house, Sean Patrick Maloney, that is, there are two Maloneys here, but Sean Patrick Maloney's house
Yes.
was drawn into the district that he did run in, but the district
Yes.
he previously represented was mostly in a different district. Is that correct?
Yes, pretty much. So Sean Patrick Maloney ran in the district he lived in, but the actual turf that he represented was in a neighboring district that was more competitive. And though the current district also is one a Republican could win, he decided that it'd be better to run in the district he lived in. And he did this without consulting with Mondaire Jones, bigfooted him out. A lot of other Democrats and progressive activists were upset. Richie Torres, the congressman in the Bronx, accused Sean Patrick Maloney, in essence, of being racist in chasing out a black incumbent. So it was a very ugly situation, but Maloney had seniority and he had money, and Mondaire was afraid of him and thought he'd have an easier time in an open seat in New York City. And he did not have an easier time. He lost.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's some, Sean Patrick Maloney is supposed to be in charge of helping the Democrats win the House, right? Or win House
Yes.
elections. So it's a little bit ironic that he didn't think he could win a Biden +7 or something, or a Biden +8, and instead had to go to the +10 or +11 to feel like he could win. I mean, it seems a little.
So the number, yeah, I have to double check the numbers. The current district he's in actually is only a few digits for Biden. It was like Biden +3 or 4 or something. I'd have to look
Oh,
at
I
that,
see.
but it's pretty competitive, the district he's in. I think what was interesting is, he put his own political survival and his own interests ahead of perhaps, the party's interests, and
Mm-hmm.
or at least didn't consult with another member of his delegation before making a political choice. I think that was something a lot of people were upset by, that he didn't really take Jones into account. He said, I'm running here, and that's that. And Jones then had to make this very tough call. And in my view, he made the wrong decision. And now, he will not be in Congress next year.
And quickly, what do you think drove that decision from Mondaire? Because it just seems to me that there's a lot more to be gained in the bigger picture politically running against Sean Patrick Maloney.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what drove that decision?
I think Mondaire looked at again. This was reported in the Intercept and elsewhere. He looked at polling. He considered running against both Bowman and Jones. His staff didn't want him to run against Bowman for obvious reasons. Bowman being a fellow progressive, and also I don't think the polling was good for Mondaire in a race against Jamal Bowman.
I
And
see.
I think I think he both was afraid of Sean Patrick Maloney and deferent to leadership. I mean, Mondaire Jones is a very talented and intelligent congressman. I do think he has a bright future. He certainly had one. And he also, unlike the squad, he is more deferential and more interested in catering to leadership. Mondaire really likes the idea of getting endorsed by Nancy Pelosi, for example, and he doesn't want to
Mm.
go against the speaker, go against the hierarchy in Washington. And I think the fact that Maloney was the head of the DCCC and Pelosi probably told him, I'm supporting Sean Patrick Maloney, I think this spooked him. I think the money spooked him. And also, he thought he'd have an easier time in New York City. There was a good report in HuffPost by Dan Moran's about how Mondaire's people thought the Working Families Party would support him for this open 10th congressional race in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Jones believed that, and he also seemed to believe a lot of local electeds and the New York Times editorial board and all these other people would form this winning coalition for him, and it just wasn't the case. And I do think that was naive on his part, because he was new to the city, and there were a lot of people running with deeper ties to the district who were going to make his life challenging.
So kind of viewed as a carpetbagger in a sense.
Yes, and I think the carpetbagger charge, it didn't stick so much, that Jones still did well. I think the bigger issue for Jones was that he just was not known in the new district at all.
Mm.
He had assumed, because he had, I think, because he had a big following online, and because he'd made a lot of cable TV appearances, and because he had a lot of money, that he was already pretty known in Brooklyn and Manhattan. And that just was not the case. Mondaire Jones is not famous like AOC is famous. He's not famous like Adam Schiff is famous. He is a few tiers down in terms of sheer fame and name recognition. And when you have low name recognition, you really have to come into a district and run very hard. I personally don't think Mondaire ran hard enough. I don't think he made himself available enough. I don't think the hustle was there. He ran like a front runner, and he never really was a front runner. and I think that
I
was a
see.
problem for him as well.
I see. He's someone I just haven't really been able to wrap my mind around, to be honest with you, because when he came in, it was 2018, right? He was part of that progressive
So
wave.
2020 actually, yeah,
Oh, 2020, yes.
I've forgotten. I was talking to someone. Actually thought it was 2018 as well, but
18. Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah.
time bleeds together. It was 2020, so he wasn't even
My
around that
gosh.
long.
Okay. Well, in either case, I remember when he was elected, and he kind of at the time was given that squad-ish branding, the progressive branding. He also, as far as I understand, was the first openly gay black congressman, right? So he kind of checks
Yes.
some of the identity box too. So it's a little bit odd to me that he has sort of flown under the radar in that way. What's your read on Mondare?
You know, Mondare, to his credit, won a very tough primary in 2020. He was filling a suburban New York City seat that had been held by Nita Lowey, who had been in Congress for a very long time. The fight to replace her was, it brought out, the wealthiest, most ambitious people in that area. I mean, you're talking about a district that includes many of the top earning households in America. And he ran against some very well funded candidates and he blew them out of the water. He did very well in
Mm,
that primary. And I don't want to, he has a high profile. I'm not trying to say he never reached the pinnacle of fame he was supposed to. Mondaire Jones was better known probably than 50 or 60 or 70% of members of Congress. Most members of
hmm.
Congress are not known to anyone outside of their districts at all. I mean, there are members of Congress, if they strolled naked into my living room, I would not know who they were. And there's probably
Yeah.
a lot I would not know who they were. And
Yeah.
that's just politics. There's 435 of them. So I think for Mondaire Jones, he's a young guy. He's getting started. AOC is very unique. There will probably never be, or at least for a very long time, an AOC, someone who wins under some circumstances and under such circumstances and is immediately catapulted to a kind of white hot national fame that was almost unprecedented in the degree that it came and how quickly it came. And then
Hmm.
that same year with AOC, you had Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Presley winning too, so they were part of this halo of interest and
Yeah.
fame and attention. That was special, right? So Mondare is a different cycle, different circumstances, but he definitely was a rising star. He was an Ivy League educated lawyer, and he had a lot going for him. And I think you and I agree, and a lot of people outside of maybe his circle thought, look, run against Sean Patrick Maloney. You may not win, but even if you lose, you will still be beloved by
Right.
the sort of progressive ecosystem, right? And that could set you up to run for something else in the future. I mean, that's the biggest thing. You're in position to do something else. Also, I think he actually had a very good chance to beat Sean Patrick Maloney. Maloney just won a primary against Alessandra Biaggi. Biaggi took like 30 something percent. And, I think the initial read in that would be, well, if Biaggi got in the low 30s, Mondare would not have won either. And, Biaggi was a state senator who really had no roots in that district either and really was not on the level of Mondare Jones. Jones was very well liked in the suburbs of New York City. He had a very good mix of progressive bona fides and an ability to appeal to more moderate voters. Ironically, he profiled as the type of person who would win that 10th congressional district in New York City. Again, the problem was he had left his old district, come pretty far down into Brooklyn, and he didn't run aggressively enough to get his name recognition to the point where he was a front runner. But I think he thought he was a front runner, and you can't campaign that way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a nice little transition there. You brought up the Maloney's race, and he ended up winning it quite handily. But Biaggi had endorsements from AOC and the Working Families Party. Is that
Yes,
correct?
she did. Yes.
So why don't I understand Maloney is really a powerhouse and had the backing of leadership in the establishment and big money and things, but I'm a little bit surprised that she wasn't able to turn out a few more votes.
I
What's your read on that?
Far less money. Biaggi
Ah,
did not raise even $1 million. She was not on TV. Maloney was someone who was on TV constantly. The New York City police union, which hates Biaggi because she supports criminal justice reform and was once a supporter to fund the police, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars attacking her in the airwaves and I think in mailers as well. Money, and that's what Mondaire had. Mondaire had money. Mondaire had several million in the bank. And you're talking about, had this race been run, a charismatic young black congressman in a district where he was already very well known. Remember, this is turf he'd represented, with several $1 million up against Sean Patrick Maloney, someone who is very easy to caricature as a creature of DC, of the establishment,
right.
very much on the moderate end. He's alienated Democrats in his own district and not supporting them. He's someone who used to be very close to Andrew Cuomo. There's a lot of ways you could attack Sean Patrick Maloney if
Oh
you're
yeah,
Mondaire Jones.
yeah.
And, I think a race like that, again, Biaggi's showing to me is a floor, not a ceiling. I think Mondaire would automatically begin a race with 30 something percent of the vote in the bank. And there's no doubt in my mind he could have gotten more votes from affluent white people in the suburbs who are more charmed by him than Sean Patrick Maloney. He had that appeal. He already won a competitive primary in that area. So to me, that was the choice. He thought it'd be easier to leave the district and carpetbag down into New York City. He was wrong, and he paid the price for it, which was not
Yeah.
winning.
Yeah. So to move on here to Nadler and Maloney, two 30-ish year incumbents, really
Yeah.
entrenched Democrats. Yeah, my understanding as an outsider was that Nadler was the favorite, but it seems like there was some surprise over just how handily he won. Can you talk a little bit about that race?
Yeah, no, when the polling, there was sparse polling, but when it started, Nadler and Maloney, and this is Carolyn Maloney, no relation to Sean Patrick Maloney, were pretty close. And I think there was even a poll that showed Carolyn Maloney ahead of him, and he ended up blowing her out. And there's a third candidate, Suraj Patel, who had run twice before against Maloney and also lost. Nadler really ran up the score against her, and I think that was surprising to people. Though polling was starting to show him gaining strength in the final couple weeks, I think the Nadler campaign did a very good job of stressing his liberal credentials. He was someone who voted against the Iraq War and against the Patriot Act and supported the Iran deal. Maloney was on the other side of all three of those votes. Nadler had a better base. The west side of Manhattan votes a lot more and is more politically organized. And Nadler really dominated her in that part of Manhattan and then got votes from Maloney's east side base. Whereas, Maloney could not touch the west side at all. So you had Nadler really holding on to his voters and even encroaching onto Maloney's turf. Maloney herself was vulnerable. She had this long running interest or fixation in the possible non-safety of non-COVID vaccines. So she was someone who
Mm.
was asking for studies into whether vaccines caused autism.
Oh boy.
She was someone who flirted with the anti-vax fringe. And again, this is not the anti-COVID vax fringe. As far as I can see, she's had no issue with the COVID vaccine. This was the pre-COVID vaccine fringe. And
Right.
she had, I mean, she said, I support vaccines, and I'm just asking questions. I'm just having hearings, but
Right.
definitely she was. I think that hurt her in the district, and Patel attacked her very aggressively on it. Nadler did too, and I think Nadler's campaign just did a better job of selling his image. Nadler is someone, he's pretty. I mean, they're both old, but Nadler seems older. He seems more sickly, truthfully. But despite that, he has an image as hard charging progressive, and I think the campaign did a very good job of having that be the story of the race.
I see. Yeah, I saw there was some that race got a little bit dirty where there was some accusations of being senile and
Yes, yeah,
uh,
Maloney attacked him for his poor debate performances, and
yeah.
it backfired for her. It didn't help her.
Well, and she had that major gaffe, or I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, but where she had said, that she understood Biden wasn't running again and thought it was off the record, and I wonder if that maybe do you think that the establishment perhaps, or the Democratic Party more specifically, didn't like her saying that and maybe came out because I saw didn't Schumer endorse Nadler, and it seemed
Yes.
like he kind of had the backing of the Democrats. Do you think that had anything to do with it?
I'm not sure, but Nadler himself was not committed to Biden running again. Maloney
Right.
got the most attention, though Nadler himself said he'd have to wait till after the midterms to see. So, my sense is, for a variety of reasons, Nadler was preferred. Schumer himself had a prior relationship with Nadler. They go way back to serving in the state assembly together.
I see.
Her gaffe didn't help in the sense that it took a lot of media oxygen that could have gone to a different issue.
Mm-hmm.
I at the time, I actually felt it wasn't a true gaffe, and that there are a lot of Democrats who don't want Biden to run again, and
Right.
she was speaking to that. But I think because it occupied so much time, it probably did not help her.
Backfired on her. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so Goldman and Yulee New, and there were a couple other progressives in that race as well, including Mondaire Jones. Obviously, Goldman pulls it out, but this one to me is probably the most interesting, just because I've seen some rumors that Yulee is considering running under the WFP ticket. First of all, can you just break down what happened in that race? Did progressives kind of hurt themselves by not consolidating behind a candidate? And do you think that it's possible that New will choose to run in the general? And if she does, supposing she does, do you think that she would stand a chance?
I do think that New was hurt by Mondaire Jones being in the race. I also think that it was not easy to consolidate, and there is not an easy one-to-one relationship where if Mondaire Jones was gone or another candidate, Carlina Rivera, was gone, these votes would all flow to Yulee New.
Mm.
So you had a wide open congressional race. Open races without incumbents almost never happen, right? This is kind of
Mm-hmm.
a once in a generation opportunity. You're going to get a lot of people running, right? And it's hard to make anyone drop out when there's no clear there's no clear front runner and everyone thinks they have a path to victory. That's just
Oh,
how
I
it
see.
goes.
I see.
Yulee New was not the obvious front runner by any means. She was doing well in the polls, but she's a state assemblywoman who had a following, but was not a prodigious fundraiser at all. She raised several $100,000. Mondaire had a lot more in the bank. It's she's someone who I do think would have benefited from probably having less candidates. I also think she's someone who may have also had trouble drawing in the sort of voter who may have chosen Mondaire or Carlina Rivera. It's a district that is
Mm.
a mix of younger progressives and socialists and affluent older voters and moderates and people living in condos in Manhattan and brownstones in Brooklyn. And these are voters who, not all of them want to send a squad member to Congress. Some may have been voting for Mondaire Jones because they liked him and felt he, as a sitting congressman, was a serious presence, and they, if he wasn't there, maybe they would have chosen Dan Goldman. I don't know. I think this assumption that all the votes could have just flown to Yulee to stop Dan Goldman is a little naive.
I see.
Does she have a chance on a third party bid to beat Dan Goldman? No. I
Gotcha.
would place her odds at fast approaching zero to win the race. Now, can she run and make a statement? Can she run and outperform expectations? Possibly. Third party bids, just as is true in other states and cities, third party bids in New York are almost never successful. If they are, they're under fluke circumstances. And I don't think this is a fluke circumstance. I think you have a Democratic nominee in Dan Goldman, who is more of a moderate, who has alienated people because he's very wealthy and he partially self-funded, but he's also the Democratic nominee who will have the support of the establishment, of organized labor, of people like Chuck Schumer. And you can certainly try to primary him in 2 years. I think that's fair. Beating him on a third party challenge logistically is pretty much impossible. And if you run the risk of looking weak and being beaten badly. Now, you can run and outperform expectations too and excite people. Sure. Can she assemble a winning coalition on a third party line, on the Working Families Party line? No. I would point to in 2020 when the Working Families Party was pushing a lot of Democrats to vote on their line to help preserve their ballot status. Joe Biden got about 70% of the vote in the district on the Democratic line, about 14% on the Working Families Party line. Could Yulee New get more than 14%? Yes, she could. Could she get more than 50%? I don't think so.
Yeah. I'm also curious with that race and the other races, but do you think if ranked choice voting was applied in these elections that may have given a different result? I'm looking at the state legislature where it appears that progressives did much better than they did at the congressional level. Do you think that that's because of the ranked choice voting, or do you think it's just different dynamics at the state level?
Well, there's no ranked choice voting at the state level. There's only
I misunderstood that. Okay.
There's no ranked choice. There's only ranked choice voting for New York City elections, municipal elections.
Not the state. Okay, I see.
Mayor, city council. Yeah, state is like congressional. It's the same deal. Would ranked choice voting have changed New York 10 in particular? Possibly, yeah. Would Yulee New have been the winner in such a scenario? I don't know. Maybe not, right? There were other candidates in the field like Mondaire Jones, like Carlina Rivera, that were really trying to make build these cross ideological coalitions. And I think in some ways they failed because they couldn't quite find a base and motivate a base, and New came closer to doing that. In our RCV election, you could have seen a different approach, a different strategy, and someone like Mondaire or Carlina could have emerged as the winner in such a scenario. I think I could definitely see a scenario in ranked choice voting where Dan Goldman does not win. Dan Goldman was being targeted by the other candidates. His negatives were going up. He was someone people would have left off their ballots. So I think it's plausible Dan Goldman loses a ranked choice voting election. But I think progressives who would say, oh, this means Yulee New wins, I don't know if it means Yulee New wins. We had a ranked choice voting Democratic primary for mayor last year that Eric Adams won, and the runner-up was also a moderate candidate in Catherine Garcia. So I like ranked choice voting. I think it's the fairest system. I think it shouldn't be misread as something that only helps one type of ideology. I mean, there were people even saying that this was before this year, who used to say ranked choice voting actually can hurt progressives or it hurts minority voting. None of that is true. It's a system that prioritizes and helps candidates who can build coalitions and work with different types of voters. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I also very much support ranked choice voting, but I think there are certainly some races and some dynamics where it actually would help sort of the establishment or the center, where people are less inclined to support the extremes. So that's just on a race by race kind of a thing. And lastly here, I wanted to get your thoughts on that special election. It seemed to me that Molinaro was somewhat of a favorite. He certainly had the money advantage from what I can tell. And in a year that was supposed to be tough for Democrats, it seemed like he was kind of the favorite, and Ryan ends up pulling it out. What do you read into that?
I agree with the conventional wisdom that the overturning of Roe v. Wade played a decisive factor there. Mm-hmm. Molinaro himself is very much a moderate Republican. I know him from when he ran against Andrew Cuomo in 2018. he's kind of the definition of the Republican the party would want to run in that district. He is someone who, in the suburbs of New York City, a moderate person who hates Trump could vote for. And he still lost. And so what it shows you is how nationalized these elections are, how polarized they are, that, even probably someone who would be barely considered a Republican by the fringes of the party, by, the most furious elements of the GOP, still lost to a Democrat, who ran aggressively on abortion rights. And, is it a harbinger of what's to come? Possibly. You don't want to overread low turnout special elections, but I do think it's very clear that abortion is playing a big role in these races, and Democratic voters are more fired up to punish the Republican Party for the Supreme Court decision.
Yeah. And then lastly here, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on the progressive wave at the state level. Seems like that's where progressives had a lot more success. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, the progressives did well. I think a lot of the energy, certainly with DSA and other activist groups, has been channeled into state legislative contests, because they rightfully understand most of the power to impact policy in New York and in other states too happens in the state legislature at the state level. I attribute their success one to good candidate recruitment. Kristen Gonzalez ran a good race for an open state Senate seat. The incumbents all won. There's been a trend of incumbents winning, so the DSA incumbents won, and then progressive non-DSA incumbents also won. So some of it was just, incumbents have been winning of late, and that includes both progressives and moderates. I think some of it is progressives and socialists are maturing to a degree. I think with each campaign cycle, DSA faces more opposition from moneyed interests and from the establishment, but they also become savvier, and they themselves become better fundraisers. So I do think, each cycle is producing more wins for DSA and adding more bodies to the movement, bringing people in, sharpening their skills, and you see that bear fruit.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your time, Ross. Can you just reiterate for the audience where they can find your work and your books and all that good stuff?
Sure. So you can find my my writing at New York Magazine. You can also read me in other outlets like The Nation. I have a Substack, rossbarkan.substack.com. It's called Political Currents. I have 3 books, 2 novels and nonfiction. You can find out more about them on my website, rossbarkan.com. That's Barkan. And feel free to follow me on Twitter. It's just my name, Ross Barkan, and you might enjoy it or you might not. But I try to be honest and honest about what I think. Put it that way.
Yeah, that's what a good columnist does, right? And sometimes you're going to piss off your readership a little bit.
Sometimes.
Well, thank you so much, Ross. I hope we can do this again. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yes, thank you for